Okay, so I mean, I thought Lucy's disappeared, didn't she? Lucy's talk was great, and it's kind of also slightly in its own right and helpful to me because it's kind of obviated some of mine. I mean, so I can condense it a bit. So yeah, as Lucy was saying, people talk, especially children these days, talk about anxiety as if it's something you can, a condition of some sort, like I've got anxiety. And I think this can obscure, and a mental health-based approach to it can obscure the sense in which anxiety can have a meaning in a way that I'll go on to explicate, right? The meaning being basically that it means that we are currently ill-equipped to deal with some of our predicaments that we're unknowingly in, often. Okay, and I think it can obscure too the way in which education, including what I'll talk about in education in the virtues, can be much more important than psychological medicine. I'm going to talk about some virtues today, things like kind of healthy pride, dignity, integrity, reparative rather than projective or self-punitive responses to guilt, courage in the face of shame and fear, wisdom, receptivity to grace, and amor fati. And I'm going to say something about how I think they can provide what we might call regulative ideals for the functioning of a viable personality or self. So, yeah, therapy can be required to unearth unconscious conflicts. And yeah, at times, someone may even need strategies of some sort, breathing or mindfulness or whatever, to manage their anxieties. But we do, I think, and here I'm going to, 48-year-old Richard is going to disagree with 12-year-old Damien from earlier on. Sometimes I think we can put a metaphorical plaster cast on a metaphorical heart. In other words, we can provide a kind of containing therapeutic environment so that some healing can take place of its own nature within the soul. But I think the main holding environment, if you like, to use Winnicott's term, is the home and the school, helping children develop ego strength through identification with those who embody the virtues I'll talk about, and secondly, through kind of thoughtful and morally serious discussion about potentially and actually live issues, moral issues in the child's life. I think focusing on those can provide a far more important way to deal with anxiety than anything that mental health has to offer. And I say that as a psychotherapist, right? So there is, I think, an age-old wisdom which is coextensive with the development of humanity itself and which is constitutive of culture, and which needs no psychological science to back it up, which is about preparing us for life by inculcating in us such virtues as make for a human life that's adapted to the kind of predicaments that human beings face. May I request a glass of water? Thank you very much. Okay, thanks. So on having anxiety is one of these most, you hear these quotes like it's one of the most common mental health conditions in the UK, estimated to affect 8.2 million people at any one time and so on, or it's an increasingly prevalent emotional disorder. Teenagers tell us, thank you, I've got anxiety, as if that were itself the kind of the end rather than the beginning of an explanation as to why they've struggled to cope with their school assignments or to spend time with their friends. And it seems to me a curious turn, both of events and of phrase, that's led to a quotidian experience becoming pathologized in this way. For in the ordinary sway of things, anxiety is no more something you've got than is sadness or jealousy. I mean, they're not illnesses, right? Or possessions, obviously, but that's irrelevant. But in being treated thus, anxiety is thereby externalized and pathologized. It's seen as afflicting rather than being an ownmost moment of the self. And from that kind of discursive tack, a whole range of inference tickets are often helpfully or unhelpfully issued. Reference to anxiety becomes exculpatory, right? Becomes something which can be an excuse. Doctor's notes can be procured, as it were. And anxiety, unlike ordinary emotions, is now seen as an ordinarily, is not now seen as an ordinarily intelligible phenomenon or as intrinsically disclosive of predicament. Okay. So it becomes obscure. And achieving anxiety's apt resolution now becomes taken to be something which requires kind of medical or paramedical kind of procedures, pharmacotherapy or muscular relaxation or breathing exercises or thought modifications or mindfulness and so on. I mean, we do have something called GAD and Lucy also talked about social phobia as well, social anxiety disorder. But I guess maybe when people say, I've got anxiety, if there's any kind of one thing they might be reaching for in that kind of psychological medicine kind of a list of diagnoses, it might be generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. I mean, but the rates in which genuine, as it were, genuine GAD occur, it's only about like 1.5% of 5 to 10-year-olds, or 6% or so of the 16 to 65 kind of year olds in England. And we might anyway ask whether or not GAD is really a useful lens, or whether or not it aids or shuts down understanding of the kind of anxieties which many children present with. Now, I said I'm going to say something about the idea of anxiety having a meaning, but I haven't yet told you what I mean by anxiety having a meaning. So let me contrast two different kind of therapeutic takes on anxiety. One will come from a kind of CBT angle, the other one from a more dynamic or an existential kind of angle. So if you think about how CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, CBT approaches anxiety, you might say, well, what causes it? Well, it might be caused by modeling or conditioning of certain sorts. Unhelpful beliefs and avoidance might maintain it. And the idea of a CBT-based treatment, at least as I used to practice it, was to treat the anxiety itself. That's what you want to do, right? You want to kind of help lower the anxiety itself through maybe exposure and response prevention, through belief challenging and modification, through a kind of mindful diffusion and distancing from anxious thoughts and so on. Okay, so that's my foil. That's the word I'm looking for. So that's anxiety not having a meaning in itself. I'm just trying to set up the idea of what it is, might be, as I'm using the phrase for anxiety to have a meaning. In that sense, it doesn't itself have a meaning. Here's the contrast, though. In either a dynamic or an existential psychotherapy, anxiety is seen as disclosive of truths about the sufferer's life. I mean, these therapies, too, have a kind of causal theory as to what, prompts anxiety. Inner conflicts, in the case of dynamic theories, confrontation with the void, I guess, in an existential context. But they situate anxiety in a developmental concept, developmental context, so that it also now shows up uncompleted tasks of individuation. Right? The anxious self can't remain self-same whilst confronting a complex world. It's at odds with itself. It's too much dependent on things going well without. It's too dependent on present others being positively valuing of oneself. Right? It's insufficiently capacious to tolerate complex, contradictory feelings. It's not yet got a shaped up enough personal idiom. It's not yet got rich enough repertoire of different emotionally alive, meaningful responses to life. And so it's blocked and it's thwarted and it's shaking and it's primitive and it's more furled than unfurled, and it develops seemingly meaningless symptoms rather than emotions. Okay, so on this kind of view, we have certain tasks of life to become ourselves, to develop courage and dignity, to retain self-possession, to grow ego capacity, capacity to tolerate and often kind of contradictory feelings at the same time, to repair rather than run from our relational struggles, to mourn our losses and so on. The American comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell said the thing I'm about to now say, quote, "It is by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. The very cave you're afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you're looking for." Okay, so here the idea is that anxiety is a good indicator, often enough, is a good indicator of where there's valuable work to be done, right, on oneself, in one's individuation, on one's growth as a person. And if you're embarked on an existential life, that is to say, on a life understood as a courage-requiring voyage of discovery and liberation and individuation, such an understanding of anxiety is itself profoundly freeing. For now it's not itself taken as defect or a condition. Instead, it's taken as a valuable indicator that hereabouts is the place to dig for the treasure of your own self-becoming. Right, so now I'm going to talk about that voyage of self-becoming in terms of the inculcation of the virtues. Because there are many more things than inculcation of virtues. But I hope, well, that's what I'm going to talk about anyway, hopefully more in a more edifying than pious manner. Okay, so patients sometimes arrive in therapy, I've noticed, without the very idea of certain virtues. They might just simply not have the idea of dignity or courage or repentance or forgiveness or gratitude, or of being philosophical about something. I don't mean in the academic sense, I mean in the ordinary sense, right? Of cultivating well, I'll tell you later what I mean by being philosophical about it. And they might not have much practice in those either. They don't have they might have the idea they might have heard the word and they might have some vague sense of it, but they haven't kind of worked up sense of it. But it seems to me that without having a rich lived sense of what those the virtues are about, you just don't stand much chance of weathering the storms of interpersonal life. I'll start with the virtue of dignity, and I'll kind of come back to it because I think it's kind of quite central in helping us organize our understanding of how other virtues are actually significant for the pacification of anxiety. So dignity, as I see it, is the kind of non-corrupt form of self-love. We find great examples of it. I've been reading some books by Elizabeth Strout recently. Lucy Barton's one of her heroes, a very dignified woman. Or I was also reading some of them, the detective stories of Walter Mosley, and these kind of very dignified, tough Black American detectives, basically. You even find someone like Jordan Peterson, the kind of controversial Canadian psychologist, has a kind of shtick which kind of relates in some ways to dignity. The idea of being willing to take personal responsibility, to shoulder life's burdens, to stand up straight with your shoulders back, etc. Right? So here the idea of is about dignity as healthy pride, being able to hold your head up high without your nose being in the air, basically. That's the kind of fundamental idea. It's often seen, especially in philosophy, as in terms of how we're treated by others. So Kant's idea of treating everybody as an end in themselves, as having intrinsic value. And that's all great, but I'm not interested in that today. I'm interested instead in how we conduct and evaluate ourselves. Shall we act in such a way so that we can hold our head up high? Can we cultivate nobility in our soul? Think for a moment of the lonely person who feels unlovable. For the lonely person, it's as if all the love is over there between the others. And it's for them as if they've been ejected from the place where love is. But the person who acts with and knows of her dignity, she's not so vulnerable to the contingencies of friendship's availability. For she can take pride in her own actions, and she can know inwardly of her own value. Yeah, I mean, pride here is not as a vice, but as a virtue, right? Okay. I'll come back to that later, I think. So, dignity, as I see it, has to do with knowing your values and then knowing that you have value because you've been acting in accord with your values. That's the kind of idea of dignity that I'm trying to make some noise for today. The dignified person doesn't take any shit from other people, and they also stand up to bullies, and they're also self-possessed and sovereign. That is, they're not in thrall to others. They've got an internal locus of evaluation, if you like. Dignity, it seems to me, comes from being loved, first and foremost. It comes from what in psychoanalysis we call the installation of a good internal object. But it also becomes, I think, from being inducted into the very idea of it itself, right? If you are given the very idea of dignity and given some examples of it, then it gives you a chance of being able to pursue it in your life and to use it in that way as a regulative ideal for handling the emotional turbulence of your life. Hopefully that'll become clearer as I talk about some of the other virtues now, and you'll see how they relate to dignity. Moral emotions, such as guilt and shame, are sometimes portrayed as undesirable. This comes back to this idea of the negative emotions that Lucy was talking about. And of course, if they're spurious, then they are, right? But if they tell the truth about our failures, then it's kind of important to get on good terms with them. To not be on good terms with guilt and shame may involve, for example, trying to project them into someone else. We have a disagreement about something, and I say no. Rather than own my bad, I kind of say no. You're the one to blame, and so on. Right? So you project the guilt elsewhere. That's perhaps the most primitive response one can have to guilt, I guess. But then there's a kind of intermediary kind of form of one's response to guilt is something like to beat yourself up about something, right? So some people come into therapy either they're busy projecting their guilt into others because they've got no capacity to tolerate it. They haven't yet been offered that chance to develop the capacity to tolerate guilt, or shame for that matter, because they haven't had a chance to install a good enough internal object which can effectively say to them, yeah, it's all right, you've been a bit of a dickhead, but we can weather this storm because you're basically still, lovable. Okay, so, but those primitive responses to try and project your guilt into someone else, but then sometimes people think, well, yeah, but I'm just going to beat myself up about it. If I make myself feel really bad, then that somehow does something to expiate my guilt, right? Right? No, it doesn't. It's unhelpful, right? What's the morally mature response to guilt? Well, of course, it's not a fear. It's not a matter of indulging this fear-fueled superego type pseudo-conscience. It's rather about guilt or the conscience as the voice of love within the self, which has to do with repentance and making reparations, right? Going and trying to put something right with the person that you've wronged. That's the whole bloody point of guilt, right? Is it's supposed to be there to help you regulate your relations with others and in that way not be left. I suppose here's the thing. If you don't understand what guilt is, if you've not been given the idea of healthy ways of guilt as a healthy emotion or something which can prompt kind of healthy reparative action in your relationships, then you're just going to be left with a diffuse anxiety, right? The anxiety doesn't wear its proper name anymore. It doesn't get understood as a moral emotion. Instead, the self just shakes and one kind of ends up avoiding or, like I said earlier, projecting it into someone else and so on. Or beating yourself up. Okay. The child who can apologize for wrongdoing to people whose opinion of her is valid and who can learn thereby to trust that ruptures can be righted, she can thereby corral what may initially be a diffuse guilty anxiety into discrete thought and reparative acts. But the child who hasn't learned to do that, she'll experience the anxiety caused by her knowledge that she's damaged her relationships with her acts and won't have any means whereby to restore those relationships or her dignity. Okay. Now, I'll just point out it takes courage to tolerate both shame and guilt. And I want to talk a bit about courage now. Because not everybody has the very idea of courage. I mean, it might sound strange, but not everybody has it. They haven't been given the idea of it as a regulative ideal for managing how one lives one's life. I see it again and again in the clinic. But without it, you can't cope with life. Right? Again, the idea of courage is something you find in all sorts of literature and film and family relationships and so on. But it's fundamentally installed by encouragement. Right? That's how you learn to take courage in life. You're encouraged in things originally. And there's a whole kind of corporeal dynamics to courage, if you like. You've got to steel yourself. That's what it is to take courage. You can feel your muscles need to tense up, not in an anxious kind of shaky way, but in a deliberate kind of, I'm going to face this way. It's a partly corporeal act. The idea of courage gives you the idea of facing down your anxiety and your fear. Gives you the idea of these being surpassable through action, of survivability. Courage can then become part of your dignity. That is, you can take pride in yourself because you've taken courage. And this then in turn makes it easier to muster because you already then feel better about yourself and you'd also feel aversive shame if you didn't take it. Dignity in this way, I think, is the fuel or motor, if you like, of many of the virtues, and including courage here. So yeah, I think even the idea of taking courage is really important. Courage must be taken. Right, it's an existential act of self-constitution. You've got to step up. You've got to step into it, if you like. You've got to make decisions. You've got to take responsibility for those decisions. Courage, pride, and responsibility and heart. Actually, I put out a tweet as a question on this on Saturday and said, what kind of moral emotions do we take, as it were? And I got a whole load of kind of takes back on that. But I think those are my favourite ones. Courage, pride, responsibility, you take them. There's an existential act of self-constitution, an immediate looping effect within the psyche in that very moment, if you like, where you can build up your kind of your character through the action of stepping into these moral emotions and these virtues. When I grasp that I could think and act other than I do, I now face a choice. And if you don't step up to face down anxiety, you end up suffering existential guilt. This courage is required for facing external fears, but also to face painful feelings within: grief, sorrow, humility. I already mentioned guilt and shame. They all require courage. And we need courage before, to mention another virtue now, we can hope. In talking about hope, I'm not talking about optimism. Instead, I'm talking about a willingness to populate the future with potential meaning, despite the fact that we may not be able to cash all of those checks. It means to being open to life and being willing to mourn one's losses. Hope deferred maketh the heart sick, but when the desire cometh, it's a tree of life, to quote from Proverbs. Hope is intrinsically antidepressive. It's anxiolytic. It's anxiety-busting, that is, as an affect. Let me give you an example of kind of courage and hope. I was thinking about many years ago, a fatherless kind of an undergraduate came to see me, and he'd had his final exams in Oxford coming up, and he was terrified about them. He'd not been given any model really of how to deal with that, and he sought consultation, and everyone was telling him about kind of how to kind of calm down, how to kind of do mindfulness, say, different techniques of calming yourself, breathing, etc. None of it was working. So we pursued something different. We thought about how he instead could power up, right? What it would be to take that anxious energy, but to bind it within the very idea of taking courage and overcoming and powering through. He needed to actively embrace, rather than to shun or inwardly watch, all of that valuable energy and strife, and to bind it together using his will, so it could be directed at its proper end, namely vanquishing the examiner's questions in the exams. It made a massive change to his psychology, and also made a kind of something of a change to my psychological practice, right? He went on and got a first, and he effectively just embraced his will to power. Let me talk about another virtue now. Wisdom, or the idea of being philosophical about something. For wisdom too is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her, to quote another proverb. I have in mind such things as staying calm in the face of what otherwise will be anxiety-provoking situations. The wise person can take a step back and can gain perspective, can gain the true measure of things, can remember that anxieties pass, they can retain self-possession and so on. The wise person doesn't tilt at fate. Fundamental to it is the kind of Stoic notion, if you like, of accurately assessing the will's realistic scope. So to quote Epictetus, the chief task in life is, I don't know what's the chief task in life, anyway, he says, the chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Reinhold Niebuhr's Serenity Prayer says something rather similar. Father, give us courage to change what must be altered, serenity to accept what cannot be helped, and the insight to know the one from the other. So you've got the idea of courage in there, but you've got the idea of when is courage appropriate, and when instead is kind of acquiescing in fate appropriate, and kind of getting with the program, as it were, of life appropriate. Okay. We've also got the Arabic idea of inshallah, if God wills it. The whole point of this, right, is to help dismantle those backfiring, omnipotent defenses against existential anxiety, our knowingness, our taking for grantedness, which end up causing more trouble than they're worth. Right? Inshallah. Right? I don't try and tilt at fate. I don't try and take control of what can't be taken control of in an effort to feel less anxiety and end up feeling more anxiety in the process. Think of the Christian Our Father, the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples and that Christians now all recite the world over. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Right? That's the idea. Not mine, but thine. And the idea of praying it is not to say, oh, come on, bring it on, It's rather to tell oneself, to help oneself get with the program, right, of a will beyond one's own. And in that way, to acquiesce in it rather than to tilt at it. Or of how Jesus, knowing his end was near, prayed, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. It's not merely an acceptance here, but a positive attitude towards the happening of that which is not under one's own control. Non-believers sometimes reduce all prayer to its petitionary form, which in turn they stigmatize as a form of wishing, if you like, an attempt to influence fate or God's will. But here in these more truly religious statements, we see prayer as precisely the opposite of that, as the difficult cultivation of an attitude of acceptance of matters beyond one's will. I'll come back to this in a minute when I'm thinking about the notion of grace. But for now I want to note that it was Nietzsche, no friend of either Stoicism or Christianity, who took this attitude to an admirable extreme. Well, it's kind of admirable. My formula for greatness in a human being, he says, is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward nor backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what's necessary, still less conceal it, but to love it. Elsewhere, Nietzsche offers us this: I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what's necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who makes things beautiful. Amor fati, let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what's ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation, and all in all and on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. Right, which is not to say it, be a yes man. He offers us the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence to make this all vivid. Imagine that you were fated to live this very life of yours an infinite number of times over, so that what happens to you today will in a future iteration of this life happen again and again and again. Can you now accept and say yes to what must happen? Can you love fate? And can you now take action wherever it's possible to make the best happen? Right? These are all ways to, as it were, to kind of vivify and make more vivid, make more graspable the concept of these virtues of things like courage or acquiescence in fate, and the idea of making that choice when everyone can, in such a way as then as one is more prepared to deal with the inexorable anxieties of life. Let me talk now, coming towards the end, about receptivity to grace. Nietzsche's love, including his love of fate, his amor fati, is not a humble love. And I think that's a problem with it, but we don't need to go into that. A humble life, though, involves gratitude. It involves acknowledgement of what hasn't been earned. Not of undeservedness, but of non-deservedness. Okay. I'm stalking here a Christian pray, really, but in the words of a well-known atheist, the musical comedian Tim Minchin, in his acceptance speech for an honorary doctorate at the University of Western Australia, he said this: "Remember, it's all luck. You're lucky to be here. You're incalculably lucky to be born. Understanding that you can't take credit for your successes, nor truly blame others for their failures, will humble you and make you more compassionate." Okay, but does any of that make you more, or does any of that make you less existentially anxious? Well, that's going to be my claim right here. A receptivity to grace, and by grace I mean seeing things under the aspect of a gift, right, that hasn't been earned, in other words. A receptivity to grace is intrinsically anxiolytic, right, anxiety busting. Okay. The concept of grace, it's easy enough to grasp in a theological context, but where we know, in other words, to whom the thanks is due. But I'll assume a non-religious audience for today. So can we make sense of the idea of existential gratitude without the idea of such a giver to whom that thanks is owed? My friend Michael Lacewing, the philosopher, gave me an example of a young mother being grateful for a moment's quiet after looking after the kids all morning, or a man out walking, thankful to find a stream on a hot day. These are, he notes, forms of gratitude that don't raise the question of to whom one is grateful. Instead, they emphasize the welcome receipt of that which is good from a source outside oneself. Okay, but why would grateful acknowledgement of luck and dependency decrease rather than increase one's anxiety? Don't our defenses against such anxiety typically involve our indulging fantasies of enjoying more rather than of less control? Well, in those moments, we learn that we don't need the omnipotent fantasies. We learn that they're a response to an overblown fear. The ego that retreats in fear and tries to make itself master, tries to live up to a job description that's impossible. Every choice we make is undergirded by what is in any case out of our control. Our hearts usually beat, our stomachs typically digest, our cells inexorably metabolize, all outside of a scope of our will. And I think religious sources provide the clearest articulations of the sentiment. But perhaps rather than it depending for its sense on a theistic outlook, the idea of grace, I mean, it's rather our independent grasp of the meaning of the sentiment which gives content here to the idea of a theistic outlook. So take that bit of in Matthew and Luke, I think it's in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Consider the lilies of the valley, how they grow, they toil not, neither do they spin. And behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them." Or, to borrow now from Julian of Norwich, as T.S. Eliot did in Little Gidding, "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." Now, isn't that preposterous, you might think? I mean, much in life is not well, and then you die. And the fowls of the air, they sometimes die by starvation too, right? But let's leave aside that appearance of a spurious, kind of wish-fulfilling, futuristic eschatology, right? And see in these remarks instead the undoing of such future-oriented worry as itself is predicated on a prior, fearful, invulnerability-seeking, omnipotent, dependency-denying state of mind. The believer who feels herself held in God's arms, or the atheist who says yes to life, the pagan who celebrates the seasons of life and death, they're all configuring their grace-filled, grateful relation with reality in such a way as to dissolve the illusory sense that they need to be in charge. Right? The anxious, grasping, power-hungry, disaster-predicting ego is invited now to take a break, to recognize the incoherence even of its own ambition. Okay. The idea here is that the present moment might not need redeeming. Right now, I'm fine, I'm breathing, as it's said. And why shouldn't the near future be a continuation of such right nows? Another way to express this thought might be with the cheesy, "I'm okay, you're okay." And I mean, that's a message that is very easy to despise and misuse. I mentioned Jordan Peterson earlier. I mean, he talks of the unhelpful, mushy self-esteem messages that tell everyone basically that, hey, you're okay just as you are, when people know damn well that they're not okay and that lives are a mess and they truly need to change a lot about themselves, right? And as with all such sayings, of course, its meaningfulness depends on its context. And one context, though, in which it does make sense, it seems to me, is that in which one hasn't yet developed the wisdom to check in with oneself and ask, leaving future-oriented worries aside, how am I in myself right now? Am I okay? I mean, I find for myself that a helpful mood hack can be for me to ask myself, how am I actually feeling right now? And asked at times of ruminatory dejectedness, the question already jolts me out of my kind of miserabilistic daydream and prompts me to notice that, well, actually, on the whole, and right now, I'm kind of doing okay. Okay. And what about all the trials of life? Can we become grateful for those too, without becoming Pollyanna-ish? Can they be fuel for the fire of your self-becoming? Out of life's school of war, what does not kill me makes me stronger, as Nietzsche put it. Which is not, I note, not here offered as an empirical fact. And after all, I mean, what does not kill me often makes me weaker empirically. I mean, but it's rather an existentialist dictum, right? Given that life is full of hardship, how can you positively relate to it? Well, one way you can do it that doesn't deplete you further is as a spur to your own individuation, as material to overcome and to assimilate. And in this way, there's an opportunity to love everything, as he put it. How do we cultivate all of that? To live in a constant awareness of how dependent one is on good fortune, on other people, on nature and its provision of food and air and light, on one's parents and ancestors. It's perhaps easier for the religious person. They can say grace before meals. Or if you're G.K. Chesterton, they can also say grace before the concert and the opera, and grace before the play and the pantomime, and grace before he opens a book, and grace before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, boxing, walking, playing, dancing, and grace before I dip the pen in the ink. But it occurs to me that the sentiment of existential gratitude, the acknowledgement of one's dependency, can surely be accomplished outside of a religious frame. Okay, so I hope I've given some sense today of how anxiety can be diffused through the pursuit of virtue. I only touched on a few such virtues. I could also have looked at faith and trust, reliability, probity, sincerity, commitment, justice, and dozens of others. But to rehearse my main point, the central anxiolytic virtue I presented it as dignity. Why? Because it installs an internal locus of evaluation inside you. You can now take healthy pride in yourself for doing your best to act with courage, with discernment, with probity, for confessing when you need to, and so on. But I've also stressed, as well as dignity, receptivity to grace, a joyful gratitude for what is not of the self. And it seems to me that moral education is the route to all of that. Children and adults, they don't automatically know this stuff. We just don't. And you can be on the run from guilt and shame for your whole life. You can never have got the very idea of dignity itself, or of living life according to such virtues as function as regulative ideals for a well-functioning, non-anxiety-ridden human life. Thanks very much.